I just had a very strange day. Yesterday was pretty weird, but today was weirder. I mentioned in that last video that I hadn't completely came back yet from that little psychedelic trip I took. And today that kinda came to a head. It was strange. Ever since the trip, I've been in kind of an afterglow, very serene feeling, noticing beauty, very introspective. Very calm and clear-headed overall. My general perception was that of a very stable unity with the world around me. But as today went on, and I woke up very early this morning, as I often do, managed to get some writing in, not as much as I'd like, but managed. But as the day went on, I kept getting this feeling that something was wrong. I don't know if you can relate to this, but when I feel like I've made a real insight into life, or I've learned something hard about myself, this is something that would occur a lot when I would do writing therapy, which I still sometimes do. I get a weird pinching feeling in my head, almost a weird sensation of motion. Not in my literal head, but kind of your mental map of where your head is. You know that sensation where you have a self-image around you, which is in the shape of your body, but kind of distorted, like your head feels bigger than your arms, stuff like that. I often feel this strange moving feeling in my head when I have kind of a therapeutic moment like that. And all throughout the day, I had this feeling of looseness and things shifting around inside my head. And as the day progressed, I developed this bizarre sensation that consciously I was fine. Whenever I sat down, I felt calm, clear-minded, and completely at peace with the world, but I kept getting this nagging feeling that something was wrong. And I kept having this increasing feeling of motion and looseness around my head. It almost felt like there were just tendrils swaying in the air, radiating from the middle of my brain. This is a subjective analogy thing, but I think you know the feeling. And again, even though my subjective conscious experience was completely calm and felt basically nothing was wrong, there was just this nagging tiny voice in the back that something was up. And at one point I got the impulse to lay down on my couch and put my mask on. Laying down in silence and putting a sleep mask over your eyes is a very common established technique with psychedelics. It is not common with ergine. It's kind of the go-to model for how to have a profound, introspective trip on mushrooms, but when I'd taken the actual trip a few days ago, it just spontaneously occurred to me that I should try this. And it did kind of work. I had a really deep moment of introspection going into myself. I'm going to do an actual proper trip report on Cellophase, but I did do this at some point, and earlier today, I just had this sudden impulse to do it again, where it was just too much. There was nothing painful or obviously wrong with my mental state, but I had this crushing feeling somewhere deep in my head, this is just too much, I cannot handle this right now. And the first thing I did was go on a walk down the street, and I was really getting some afterglow effects from the substance. Colors were shockingly vibrant. There was a lack of hierarchy in the visual information I was taking in. I looked at a mother and child walking opposite me on the far end of the street, and there was a huge cloud of flower petals floating behind them from the trees, and when I turned to look at them, I saw everything with no real hierarchy of what was important within my field of vision, and very beautiful image, obvious afterglow effects. This was just to clear my mind, so at several points I stopped just to look at the bundles of flowers growing out of my neighbors' yards, trees growing in the little grassy area between the road and the sidewalk. I probably spent a good 10 minutes standing next to a tree that was just really, really pretty and had a lot of neat little patches of moss growing on it. Visual artists have a thing they do where they can kind of soften their perception and suppress the tendency of the mind to view things in a practical, symbolic sense, and just kind of receive visual information without over-processing it, which is part of how they draw. Talented artists can do this instinctively. I am not a talented artist. I can sometimes do this if I try to for a while. But I was standing with my head near the crook of this tree trunk where it started to split, looking upwards at the boughs and the patches of moss and the light glistening off to them, and it was so three-dimensional and beautiful that I couldn't hardly handle it. I kept having moments of this as I walked around, and at one point I started tearing up a little bit, and I legitimately could not tell if it was how pretty everything was, or if it was me having not blinked in a really long time because of what I was doing and tearing up from the air and wind. I could not tell. And as I got back to my apartment, again, was feeling very fine overall, but some part of me was just, it's too much. And it occurred to me that sensory deprivation or some kind of meditation might be the right response, so I lay down, put the mask on, and kind of repeated the position I had been in the trip a few days earlier. And I sank into this feeling of quiet. And just laying down and trying to meditate and do nothing is not something that comes naturally to me. I only really do that when I have a need to. But I very quickly fell into this kind of trance, and I almost started to enter an altered state of consciousness that resembled the trip, only in a very diminished form, where I only went about 5 or 10% as deep as I did during the actual trip, but I still kind of went in. And during the trip, I had had some moments of insight, and I didn't get super far deep, but I had kind of started cracking into some deep-seated emotional issues, and I have decided to approach psychedelics for basically 2 reasons. One, I have some peculiar theories about reality and metaphysics and experience that I want to dive into, and I think psychedelics are necessary to explore that. And the second, and probably more important reason, if I'm being honest with myself, is just from what I've learned about their ability to heal mental trauma and help people grow and get over their problems, I've come to really believe if there is any hope for me at all, it lies in the psychedelic realm. And even if there is an element of risk to this, I just have to do it. And if the government is going to foolishly suppress psychedelic therapy, I will just be one of the guinea pigs acting out on my own. Although I have a wealth of people who have came before me and are currently doing this to draw from, which diminishes what I just said. And as I laid on the couch, some of it came back. I had some of the experience I had had while tripping, and some of those issues came back, but I kind of felt compelled to put it into language more than I had during the trip. So I kind of ended up sitting on the couch, mumbling to myself and trying to create verbal representations of things I had learned, dealing with some pretty heavy stuff. And as I got up off the couch, I had this sensation that, okay, I did that. That's what I needed to do. That's what the problem was. There's all this loose stuff rattling around my brain, and now I did that, I can get up off the couch and get back to my day. And that was kind of true. But it didn't feel completely consolidated yet. I kind of had this feeling like I need to sleep on this for a few days to really let these ideas and memories process properly. And there was still this feeling of looseness. And I really started to seriously think about the concept of, I don't know if this is a term other people use, but I want to say psychic load. Where in the psychedelic community, there is a very strong philosophy with a lot of people endorsing it of do the trip, take it very seriously, get very into the experience, then step away from it and just work on what you've seen. Work on the information, digest it, process it. Don't trip continuously over and over again. Get the information and then make sense of it before you go back. For example, Alan Watts was of the opinion that LSD could be an incredible tool for growth, but after you do it 5, 6, 7 times, that really should be it. You learn the lesson and then you fuck off. I think Alan Watts actually coined the phrase, once you get the message, hang up the phone. And that is repeated very, very often in the psychedelic community, because when people go off the deep end, it seems to be when they just do it too much and they start tripping without really thinking about what they're doing. And the person who's basically my greatest psychedelic role model, Terrence McKenna, kind of my guiding force in all of this, despite being one of the most prolific speakers on psychedelic thinking ever, he was very, very conservative in how he approached it. Talking about psilocybin mushrooms, he's the one who standardized the idea of 5 grams in silent darkness as the hero's journey, an extreme psychedelic trip where you go very far in and have this kind of rebirth if it goes well, which it does for most people. He was very open about the fact that at most points in his life, he only tripped a couple times a year, really. He would sometimes talk about cannabis and say that he really regretted how big a pothead he was, because he thought marijuana had a lot of potential if you'd approach it with that same mentality, completely lose your tolerance by not doing it for a long period of time, and then just completely smash yourself. But with every other psychedelic substance, he was basically in line with that philosophy. And as I said in that last video, when I did this trip, which really was my first somewhat intense trip, that first trip I did the report on, It was definitely a psychedelic experience, but it was mostly an aesthetic one. There was this external liveliness present throughout the whole experience. I had some really interesting insights and moments of introspection when I was on that trip, but basically the whole time I was sitting at my computer, I was listening to music, I was having fun, I was eating snacks. It was a very easy trip. And this one I just did was not a hard trip. I definitely don't think so. By the standards of what I hear, it was perfectly pleasant. But it was a much heavier trip in that there was a section of it where I was diving into myself. I didn't have actual ego death, but I was on the fringes of it, I think. I kind of dissolved into my couch and felt myself fade into the space around me. Like I said, I was wearing a mask, and at a few points I did open my eyes, but the gap of room that I could see under the bottom of the mask, it was like I was in a giant black room and there was a window 300 feet away and 50 feet in the air that some light was streaming through. It felt very distant, and my breaths were kind of labored from the vasoconstriction and were these weird interruptions into an otherwise very deep, tranquil state. And this is not something Ergine is known for, but I kind of heard voices at some point. Psilocybin is infamous for its ability to create voices and kind of entities that you encounter and can communicate with when you're in there on a really heavy trip. It's harder to gauge that with LSA, Ergine, partially because the drug is not very popular and it's also known for being strange and very individually variant. And as I've said, I have not done LSD yet, but LSA is often talked about as kind of occupying a middle space between LSD and psilocybin. And I went to the forums today and I did find that some people do encounter voices and entities in there. The voice was very quiet, very muddled, and very tame. I knew I was collaborating in its creation to an extent, but it was there. There were words involved in the introspective process that were not completely voluntary. One of my notes for the trip was that the deep part of the trip was worth the rest 10 times over. And didn't last that long, but me and the seeds kinda had a conversation. Very quiet, very still, very tame, very controlled, but it was there and the words were definitely not completely my creation. Psilocybin is often described as having an elfin or Irish quality, in that when you get it speaking to you, it has kind of an alien intelligence, and what it teaches you is sometimes confusing in that it seems almost inhuman in what it values and how it thinks. And I definitely got that during this trip. I got some information and perspective on my emotional problems, which was, I don't know if I should say kind, but very decent with me and very there for me. I guess you could say empathetic. Treated me in a very understanding, open way would be a good way to put it. But also had this strange quality where its perspective on me and my problems was inhuman. Imagine if a mouse could talk, and it came to you for psychological help, and the mouse begged you for advice, saying it spends its entire life living in fear of cats. It constantly scurries around, terrified a cat's going to find it. It has nightmares about cats. When it smells a cat, it goes into a complete and utter panic. Its daily existence is almost unbearable because the cats are so terrifying as a presence in its mind. And then you lean forward to the mouse and say, "You're a mouse. What on earth would you expect?" And the insight I got was completely invaluable, and I know that it is going to play a massive role in me healing to the extent that I'm able to. And I also know that future trips are almost certainly going to build off of this information. But it was not sugar-coated. It was just a very frank, there you go. There was no malice in the interaction whatsoever, but it was very sheer, austere, frank, blunt. It was not a tactful exchange. It just kind of grabbed the little shard of thought that to it was obvious but was kind of novel to me because I had never processed the information properly, even though it was obvious once I saw it that way. Shoved it into place and just kind of left it there, I think. And I realized today that most of me is completely fine. Most of me is in a really good mood, actually. Most of me just had a life-changing positive experience and is kind of at peace with the world. Today had some rough patches, but my usual melancholy is far less than it usually is. But it occurred to me, there are circuits in my mind that have been built up over the course of 20 or more years that have been violently wrenched out of position, left in a frayed, bleeding, damaged state, and are basically screaming out in pain as they're being wiped out of my memory system and perception structure. Even if most of my psyche is completely fine, there are these little chunks of extremely entrenched, painful, destructive patterns that are kind of in the process of dying, and those loosened perceptions have not been completely rewired back into the structure yet. And as I started to map this and come up with a model of what was going on inside my mind, it really started to occur to me that this is a lot like when you have a really painful revelation about yourself or something really traumatic happens, and you feel basically normal, but you just know that somewhere deep inside you, there's a connection that once it's made, you are going to start crying. You are completely okay moment to moment, but at some point in the future, this is going to hit. Like when someone dies and you're fine during the actual procession, but then you see a song that you used to listen to with the person and you suddenly start crying or something like that. I came to terms with the idea that this was like surgery in a way. I just dove in and cut a bunch of shit up. Even though the surgery is necessary for long-term health, you still have to recover from the surgery after you do it. And as this became clear, I just realized you could not pay me to trip again in the near future. As I said in that last video, the return cast, I had felt a little iffy on the time frame of this trip, and today it occurred to me that I'm just a little loose. I'm a little overloaded. I'm still pretty early in this process. The changes I'm making are pretty big. I'm not used to this yet. With an experienced tripper, they've probably dealt with a lot of the initial roadblocks and obvious problems. I have not yet. I still have a lot of the basics to get down here. And I basically settled on, I need at least a few weeks to get some good night's sleep, slowly walk through what I've learned and figure shit out. And to make things worse, my borderline, not really ego death experience had given me an insight into what it probably feels like to die. And a recurring theme in both trips was this incredible feeling that time is not what I think it is, or at least not what I did think it is. I had this incredible certainty that the notion of time as humans perceive it is just so funny. As if someone making plans to do something 10 minutes from now was the funniest joke a conscious being could possibly tell. And as I said, this is partially an exploration of my crazy metaphysical theories. So there was a point today where I was walking around my living room, which is basically my entire apartment, tapping the walls and surfaces, walking from one corner to another, looking at my feet and feeling time pass as I move, kind of muttering to myself, I don't think this is real. I don't think time is real. I don't think space is real. This is a simulation. Who put me in here? Obviously, objects are this primal mass of energy and consciousness, and the concept of time and space is a way of spacing them apart from each other so that we can interact with them in a narrative way. What are we doing here? And having that thought at the exact same time, I was mulling over the realization that we're misunderstanding death, and death might not actually be the end, because how does that work with the time thing? And I was in a point where I kind of looked at myself and said, it might be a good idea to back off a little bit here. Giving yourself appropriate time to become normal again is probably a vital process of not going fucking crazy while you're questioning the fabric of reality. And to be clear, if you're worried about me, don't be. I'm fine. I mean, I'm not fine. That's why I'm doing this, but I'm not going to try to escape the Matrix or anything. At least for a while. That's where we're going to bring in DMT, which I do not have yet. And not as much as the other day, but still feeling kind of sensitive. Partially because the experience just burns you out. My notes from the trip are filled with massive stretches of nonsense letters, mostly A, S, D, J, K, and L, and semicolon, because the act of typing on my keyboard made it feel like I was coming out of my fucking fingers, and I had trouble stopping myself from mashing random keys. I had some salami again, and the taste was so taste that it was more taste than any taste I've ever tasted. My brain fucking exploded with the unparalleled godlike joy of feeling salami touch your tongue. My nerve endings are just a little... I'm almost recalibrated, still not totally there yet. And as all this stuff came together, I was just having a hard time earlier. And I gotta tell you, Netflix came through in the fucking clutch because on a whim, I decided to watch a show I'd heard about and wanted to try, but hadn't really been in the mood for yet. Pendleton Ward and Duncan Trussell's new collaboration, The Midnight Gospel, which was perfect. I can't even say the show itself was perfect, but not only do I feel like this show was made for me, I feel like this show was made for me to watch today. I needed this. This show brought me back. This was so perfect and beautifully exactly what I needed at this exact moment, and I am so grateful to have gotten this. If you don't know what the show is, Duncan Trussell has a podcast, I forget the name, you can look it up, and the show takes some of his favorite conversations and interviews he's done and unites them with these crazy, psychedelic fantasy plots, where Duncan Trussell's character is this weird, pink guy named Clancy, where he's just this hippie type dude who lives in this crazy reality bending location where time and space doesn't really make sense, but he just lives in this little trailer in the middle of nowhere. And he has this vagina-shaped machine, which is a reality simulator where it's this supercomputer that has this panoply of crazy fantasy worlds inside of it. The show obviously is taking a book from Rick and Morty where all these worlds are zany places, although in this case they are explicitly fictional places, not alternate dimensions. Although from this show's perspective, I'm not sure what difference that actually makes. And there are points where it gets kind of ambiguous. One gimmick is Clancy's hobby is taking souvenirs. So whenever he goes to one of these simulated locations, he always grabs an object to bring back with him, usually a pair of shoes. And once he brings them back, they are real. They are physical objects in his normal world. Some of which are living creatures or magic interdimensional superpower things. And the line between his world and those is blurred. It is pretty openly a metaphor for psychedelic trips. The very first person he talks to is actually Drew Pinsky, and that was a really cool thing too. I really like Dr. Drew as a personality, and the very first episode is he goes to this world taken over by a zombie apocalypse, and the president who's fighting them is Dr. Drew Pinsky, and they have a whole conversation about the legalization of drugs and their role in human society, which was really interesting. I haven't listened to Dr. Drew in fucking years. It was nice to hear him again. And the framing device for the show is Clancy is an internet personality, basically. He's doing a podcast. So he goes into these other dimensions and just finds an interesting, crazy, interdimensional creature to have a conversation with. But the conversations are, I think, re-recordings of conversations Duncan Trussell had on his actual podcast, but blended into a crazy fantasy situation where he'll be doing something insane. He'll be in a weird medieval world, riding with a lady knight to go kill the evil butt wizard who murdered her husband. And that plot will continue throughout the entire episode, but most of it will also involve dialogue, which is basically the podcast. So it'll be very chipper, eclectic, humorous, casual conversation in the midst of a crazy, trippy scenario, and it's a lot of fun. It doesn't always work equally well. Sometimes the visuals and the story of what's going on meshes amazingly with the conversation Trussell had with a guest. Sometimes not. My second favorite episode is episode 7, where he has a conversation with the embodiment of death, basically the Grim Reaper. And the arc of the show is him and Death going through the underworld and seeing crazy spiritual structures and crossing the river Styx, doing stuff like that. And the conversation it's paired with is this actually fucking crazy interesting talk about the funeral industry and the history of the practice of embalming, and a discussion of how participating in the process of taking care of a dead body of a loved one and providing their hospice care can be a really soul-enriching experience. Those sync so perfectly that it's just amazing, but sometimes the conversation does feel a little at odds with the actual visuals. That one I mentioned with the knight is maybe the biggest example. It just wasn't really there for me. It was also one of my least favorite conversations. The episode was not bad, but the conversation was about communication and talking to people, but the plot was about revenge, and it really just didn't sync up that well. And the first episode, the one with Drew Pinsky, not a perfect synchronization, but Dr. Drew is just such a fun speaker that it really worked. And also it combines zombies with the resistance to weed legalization, so there's kind of a metaphor in there somewhere. It's also heavily implied that some of these worlds are so wacky because Clancy is both cheap and a fucking idiot. He acquired his simulation machine under very suspicious circumstances, and it is constantly implied that he does not care for it properly, even though it's this crazy reality distorting device. And it seems that the wackiness of the worlds he goes to are kind of a result of the fact that they are just these decaying, abandoned cosmoses that are inside of a machine that's supposed to be maintained and presided over, but Clancy's just a fucking negligent moron. And as a result, almost every world inside this is suffering some kind of apocalypse or is on the route to it. Not every conversation is a 10 out of 10, but god damn do they have some interesting, insightful conversations. And they were so relevant to my current concerns and thinking that it was shocking. More than one episode is about death and meditating on what it really means and how you're supposed to react to it. The very first episode is about drug legalization and the role that hallucinogens are supposed to play in society. One takes place in you could say a kind of prison. It gets into Buddhist ideas of reincarnation, redemption, and possibly the best conversation, or at least second best. The last episode, we'll get to that, but it trumps everything else. But maybe the second best conversation is this episode where there's this fishbowl person who's on top of a body where his entire thing is about the history of the occult and Western esotericism and magic and weird fringe religious movements and how it contrasts with Eastern philosophy and how the character there is using occult practices to facilitate his own spiritual growth. And it creates these crazy parallels between Western underground religion and Eastern paths to enlightenment. And it was so fucking interesting, and I just am now getting really into that. Well, that's a lie. I'm just now deciding to get really into that. I've known about Hermeticism for a while, but have not looked into it deeply. I get the impression that Hermetic ideas are going to be really, really fucking relevant to my perceptions and what I'm working on. And that's another crazy coincidence. Today, Don Jolly dropped another video, and until I started watching Midnight Gospel, that was my only real distraction from what was happening. And in the comments, he mentioned that he did his thesis, I think, on John Dee, who was one of the big Hermetic philosophers. And I left a comment saying, can you recommend a good book to learn about Hermeticism? And he recommended me a book about the history of the occult, which was written in the 70s. And that's the other big, awesome coincidence which kind of propped me up today. Although my favorite YouTubers having interests which intersects with mine probably isn't a pure coincidence, but whatever, I'll take it. God loves me. The drugs told me so. The subject matter is so fun, and the visuals are crazy. There are many places where the frames are kept low, but they can usually make it look fun or appealing. And the art for this show, there is literally no word to use for it other than psychedelic. It is just this pure mystic entity. It's crazy colors, crazy gradients, mystic imagery, things transforming and being destroyed and born constantly. If you're someone who will latch onto a show just because it has crazy visuals, this is a must watch. They can be simple, but in such a charming way that you just can't help but smile when you look at it. And the visuals are genuinely detailed and crazy pretty goddamn often. And even if the animation is limited sometimes, they always find a way to make it fun. One of the themes of the show kind of is the discrepancy between people's spiritual aspirations and who they are, where I wouldn't call them hypocrites, but there's this constant contrast where the conversations are really high-minded and abstract, and the plots are usually these crazy mystic adventures, but just moment to moment, people are just being dudes. They're hanging out. They're fine. The main character, Clancy, is really likable, partially because he's just Duncan Trussell, with a couple flaws thrown on, and one thing that makes this show so fucking beautiful is you can see how much Duncan Trussell really had in terms of involvement. It's fucking kinda crazy. During the actual conversations, most of what Clancy says is stuff that Duncan said in real life. So you're seeing his actual thoughts and philosophies and positions play out in the character in the most literal way possible. And Clancy's this young, struggling artist, or actually he's not that young. That's a joke in the show too. Clancy is literally Duncan Trussell's age, or what his age was at the time of recording. But he's this weird fantasy creature, so he looks like he's fucking 20 or something. And he's living this crazy erratic lifestyle where he's living in poverty and he's a struggling artist who can barely get views. Which is another reason I related to Clancy. We're basically doing the exact same thing. Actually, literally the exact same thing. I'm just him without the conversation partners or cheer. And they take it pretty far. Clancy and Duncan Trussell literally have the same birthday. They were both born on April 20th. And that's another thing. This is the official end of 4/2020, which is kind of appropriate. If we're gonna talk numerology, I picked a very good time to get into my extracurricular activities. And binging this show is a good note to end that on. But Duncan and Clancy are basically the same person, which means he is preternaturally charming and lovable in spite of the sketchy situations. The tone of the episodes is very odd, where everyone is kind of chipper about the situation they're in, even if they're in genuine danger. A majority of the time, Clancy is not in real danger because he's an astral projection inside an avatar. He will come back, but the people around him are vulnerable, and many of them do die. There's an almost dreamlike quality to how the shows play out, where characters will be in life or death situations, but they'll also keep up this chipper conversation with this total stranger. And that's jarring and doesn't completely match, but again, this is a metaphor for drug tripping or potentially dreams, depending on how you look at it, so it actually works in this context. There's this disconnect between how people are supposed to feel about a situation and how they actually do, but the mismatch between behavior, emotions, and what you should be feeling, that is a huge theme in the conversations Duncan has with these people, so it all kind of works and comes together. It's really strange for the main voice actor to be this central to production, but the result was fantastic. I'm fucking thrilled they did it. You really feel like you're getting to know Duncan very well, sometimes in surprising ways that you wouldn't expect. The first episode has a whole sequence where he talks about how he would get so angry when he was a young man and how he gradually got better at that. And Duncan is normally such a laid-back guy in his media appearances that I had no idea. And I've never watched Duncan's actual podcast. I just know him from his appearance on other things. Maybe I need to check it out. Or if I'm lucky, they'll just keep making this show forever and I'll never have to. And like I said, this show, I feel like there's this unity between this literal exact moment in my life and what this show is, where as deeply arrogant as it is to say, I feel like this was made to get me through this moment. If anyone else out there has that as well, we can share that experience, but I kind of feel that way. And the last episode fucking destroyed me. It was one of the best episodes of anything I've seen in a while. The second to last episode is the one where he meets death and has a conversation about how to handle death and dying and what it means in our life, and that episode definitely deserves an award. Episode 8, the last one, deserves all the awards. It was perfect. It was fucking unbelievable. The last episode is about Duncan Trussell did a podcast with his mother before she died of cancer. And the entire episode is this double-length feature of cartoon versions of Duncan and his now deceased mother having this conversation about life and parenthood and death and what it all means. And it was rough. About 4 minutes in, I started crying, and that continued right to the end. Even now, it's hard to talk about it. Probably the hardest part. Oh fuck, I'm starting to cry. I'm starting to cry again. Probably the hardest part of it is that you get this really clear picture of who his mother is, and she is a preternaturally sweet and intelligent person. I learned later that she was a psychologist. She is interesting and articulate in a way where you would expect her to have been a guest there to represent like a major scientific institution or something, not just the host's mother. And they have this incredible conversation about like everything. They talk about parenting and the insight she has into what it's like to have children and raise them to adulthood. They talk about mindfulness, which is something that came up in many episodes, with his mother giving her theories on how you can meditate, bring yourself in, use your self-perceptions to separate yourself from the chaos of your mind and move forward in life and get some perspective. And it gradually turns to the topic of her terminal cancer and death, which again, by the time of the actual show, she had died from it. And they go through the topic of facing mortality and her perspective on facing her own death and how she wants people to handle it. And you really get a perspective on what an incredible woman she was, as well as how these two have a really incredible relationship. Duncan himself is a very intelligent man. And even then, you can tell that he's just totally outmatched by how on top of things and insightful his mother is and how smart she is. And the fact that a very accomplished speaker, podcaster, entertainer, comedian guy can be in his mid-40s and still look up to her as an actual parental figure to that degree and still maintain this incredible respect. It really makes you realize what a big loss that was and how hard that must have been to share with the entire world. The only thing I can even remotely think of that reminds me of this is in a comedy album by Doug Stanhope. I think it was Beer Hall Pooch, or however you say it, where he told the story of how him and his brother euthanized their mother by giving her pills that she could use to commit suicide because she was facing a very painful death, which is maybe the ballsiest comedy bit I've ever seen, and Doug Stanhope is a notoriously ballsy comedian. But in that case, it was very abstracted and told in a very indirect, funny way where the gall is incredible, but the tone is never that sad. Where Duncan Trussell is being very raw and emotionally open about how hard this is. And it's pretty incredible that he did that. It's hard for me to really know how much of this is going to translate to other people. But if it's getting to me, I assume there are plenty of people who will have a similar reaction, even if it's not as whatever I'm doing right now. But some stuff that happened was so geared towards where I was mentally and emotionally that it was almost freaky from my perspective. Kind of an obvious one is there's a section where they're kind of talking about emotional openness, and she basically gives permission to cry. And at that point, I did not need to be told that, but it was there. There was a moment near the end where they were talking about love and understanding as being woven in with the fabric of the universe, and I just had an experience that was very in line with that, which of course ties into some of the big themes and motifs of the show as well. When I was having the trip, and this kind of came back earlier today to a degree, one of those realizations I had, where I never would have thought in a million years this is what the message is going to be, but after I got it, it seems so fucking obvious, was I got this strange, sudden moment of clarity, where I got this appreciation for just how hard it would be to be a girl, and realized that many of my relationship problems over the years has been partially a result of me having a hard time really understanding and empathizing with the way women experience emotions, which is kind of different from men, and just things they have to deal with that we don't. And no spoilers, but Clancy has a crazy gender-bending moment, which played into that so perfectly. It was like, wow, it felt almost too good to be true while it was happening. And maybe the weirdest one of all is mushrooms have become this uniting metaphor and symbol, kind of guiding the entire course of my life at this point. Partially because of my growing interest in psilocybin mushrooms, partially because I'm going out into the woods and occasionally picking mushrooms, partially because mushrooms are this huge overarching symbol throughout the entire psychedelic community. I've developed this infatuation with Terrence McKenna, who came up with the stoned ape hypothesis, which centers around psilocybin mushrooms, and mushrooms were heavily associated with him while he was alive. And mushrooms have become a metaphor for my understanding of the world in a very weird way we'll get into much later. And at what might have been the hardest emotional point of the entire episode, there was this sudden, unpredictable, unforeseeable explosion of mushroom symbolism that came up. And I was just in awe when that happened. And again, I couldn't really believe it. Okay, I'm past the hard part. I hope you appreciate the last 10 minutes took me like an hour to record because I couldn't control myself. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this. Like I said, a big part of why I'm doing this is for purposes of therapy and an attempt to fix aspects of myself which are resistant to other forms of help. And increased access to my own emotions and more openness is one of the goals. And not even because that's something I want necessarily, so much as it's just obviously part of the problem here, and that's something that psychedelics have a very strong track record with being able to help with. And to an extent, becoming a psychedelic person is becoming a more emotionally open person. And I do believe that today was a part of the process. I hope a totally normal part of the process. I imagine other people go through stuff like this. Even with these relatively low-dose trips with obscure substances, I'm already getting this pretty powerful taste of how psychedelics have this ability to get in there and break apart negative, destructive, entrenched thought patterns. But I'm also learning that there's a cleanup process and a post-treatment care plan you have to approach it with as well. And I'm not entirely sure how, but this show did something pretty special with helping me through that. And I really have to hand it to the people who made it. And while most people in the world are not in the middle of an insane plan to use psychedelic therapy to heal themselves of past trauma, but even for people not doing that, this show is definitely worth a look. It won't hit everyone as hard as it hit me today, but it's something special, and I think there's a lot of value in it. I can't believe this took 2 hours to record, but here we are. 2020 is over, and at least in this regard, I made good use of it. Watch Midnight Gospel, take care, see you later. Oh, and if you didn't notice, I got a AT4040. This is my first video with the new sound equipment. Yay.